Rabbi Michael Leo Samuel, and I have been the rabbi here in this community since about 12 years or more. I'm losing count. I've been a rabbi now for 48 years. That's a pretty long time. I guess that would make me a senior rabbi by at least California standards. And my background is kind of unique in some respects. I was raised as a Reform Jew. I became ultra-Orthodox as a teenager. And my father always used to say to me, and my father was a Holocaust survivor, and he was studying for the rabbinate himself when he was in Europe before the war. And he used to say you could always go downward once you're an Orthodox rabbi. You can become a conservative rabbi, Reform rabbi, Reconstructionist rabbi. He says, but the reverse isn't always the case. And he was actually correct. And so I was very Orthodox. I was ordained at age 21. Whoops. And I remained Orthodox until I was about 30 years old, 31 years old. And then I decided I wanted to become a conservative rabbi. I served in San Francisco, California, and we did a lot of fun activities there. We had the very first Jewish nightclub in California called Catskills West. It was a lot of fun. And I was involved with Professor Jacob Milgram, and we had one of the very first pulpit exchanges in the United States. And this is where an Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbi exchange pulpits as we try to create a dialogue. I guess you could probably call it intra-faith dialogue as opposed to inter-faith dialogue. Intra-faith is a discussion of faith from within the Jewish community itself. And I've written many books. I've written about 7 books on Philo of Alexandria, first century Jewish philosopher. And I've completed a brand new series entitled Maimonides' Hidden Torah Commentary. I've also written The Unknown Jewish Commentator, the unknown English Jewish Torah commentator, Marcus Kalish, who lived in the beginning of the 19th century, wrote one of the very first commentaries on the Bible in English, remarkable work. I've written my own work on Pentateuch. I wrote a book on the God and the Pandemic, as well as a book on gentle Judaic wisdom. You see right here, which is a book that contains a lot of very important Jewish aphorisms. It's a book written primarily for beginners. I'll be referring to it tonight because the subject matter is at the very beginning of the book. Now, let's talk about tonight's topic. Part 1, defining the Torah on one foot. This is a very fascinating question. Picture yourself as a Jew living in the first century. Picture yourself as a Jew living in Alexandria, Egypt, which was a rival to Athens. You had some of the greatest philosophers. You had the great library of Alexandria, put together by Ptolemy Philadelphus II. And Jews were living in a predominantly secular environment. In a lot of ways, you could say that the Alexandrian Jewish community was very similar in a lot of respects to the American Jewish community. And most Jews did not read or speak Hebrew. They spoke Greek. And you might be surprised to know in the first century, Greek was so popular in the Holy Land that Rabbi Gamliel, one of the most famous rabbis of the first century, said you could read a Torah in Greek, and it would be the same as if you read it in Hebrew. In fact, we have pictures of Torah scrolls dating back to the first century, resembling the Torah scrolls that we have today, except for one major difference. It was written in Koine Greek. Alexandria was a very enlightened place, but it was also a place where there was considerable anti-Semitism. And why was there so much anti-Semitism in Alexandria? Well, a lot of it had what to do with the politics that affected the Holy Land. And the Romans found the Jews to be a very, very difficult people to govern. Now, the fact you had some very corrupt Roman emperors didn't help much. The fact that you had a Roman governor in Alexandria who did his best to placate anti-Semites, that didn't help much either. And Jews were considered to be almost like a pariah nation by the Romans and by many of the Hellenistic elements of Alexandria. To combat anti-Semitism, what did the Jews do? Well, they composed the very first translation of the Bible called the Septuagint. And the name Septuagint means 70. And the number 70 is very significant because Moses had 70 elders assist him. Moses could not reach out to all the people on his own. He needed...
Rabbi, the Greeks had them come together to do this, didn't they?
What?
Didn't the Greeks invite them to come to Alexandria?
Jews were among... Okay, that's a good question. Jews were among the founders of Alexandria. And the reason why was because the Jews were a very mercantile people, a cosmopolitan nation that was used to doing a lot of business with other Mediterranean countries and peoples. And Alexander, even according to rabbinic tradition, was favorably disposed towards the Jews. Now, Alexander the Great didn't get along with the Samaritans. The Samaritans decided they were going to fight against Alexander. That didn't end very well for them. But the Jews got along beautifully with Alexander. So, the city of Alexandria is built, the library is built, the translation of the Bible was considered to be such an epic event that it was almost as if there was a new revelation to the world. And the Bible was translated into Greek for many reasons. Number one, Jews didn't know how to read Hebrew. But number two, they wanted to win over the Gentile world. And this is important. The Jews of Alexandria did not have a negative view of the Gentiles. They felt they had an obligation to reach out to them and welcome them to the faith. And so, in the very first century, people started asking the sages or the spiritual teachers and philosophers of that time a very important question. What does it mean to be Jewish? If you could summarize, briefly of course, what does Judaism stand for? What would be your answer? Well, giving a What?
Fairness. Justice.
Okay, fairness, justice,
Belief in one God.
belief in one God. You might say Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But how do you summarize a religion in one line? To give you an analogy what this is compared to. When I was in the Midwest, the synagogue was right next to a cemetery. And I used to go walk through the cemetery and familiarize myself with the names of many of the older congregants who had passed on. And one of the things which I found most remarkable about the cemetery were the epitaphs, the statements that summarize a person's life. And it's a sobering question to ask yourself. If you were to summarize your life, what would you say about it? It's not an easy question. It is a thought-provoking question. And it's the same kind of question that Jews in the first century asked when they would, when people wanted to know what does Judaism stand for. So let's take a look at some of the responses. Let me give you an early response. A Jewish philosopher lived 2,200 years ago. His name was Ben Sira. He says, forgive your neighbor for the wrong he has done, and then your sins will be pardoned when you pray. Does anyone harbor anger against a neighbor and expect healing from the Lord? If you have no mercy towards another like yourself, how can you seek pardon for your own sins? If a mere mortal harbors wrath, who will make an atoning sacrifice for his sins? Meaning that we can't ask God for something that we're not willing to give ourselves in terms of our own interpersonal relations. So you can say that that's one early example of the golden rule, that we can't have double standards for how we treat people and expect God to be magnanimous towards us if we're not really willing to reciprocate towards others around us. Now, who invented the golden rule? And if you ask your Christian friends, they'll tell you it was Jesus.
Jesus.
Or if you ask Jews, we'll tell you it was probably Hillel. But what if I were to point out to you that neither one of them invented the golden rule? Philo of Alexandria, who lived before Jesus, wrote, no one shall do to his neighbor what he would be unwilling to have done to himself. Well, that's an early formulation of the golden rule. Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the early books that was not included into the Christian Bible, but it's valuable because it contains a lot of important information about Jesus. Now, I mentioned Jesus, not because, God forbid, we're Messianic Jews, we're not. But we see Jesus as a chacham. Jesus was a sage of the first century. In fact, in Israel today, you'll be surprised to know that there are many Orthodox rabbis, like Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, and scholars, who are very interested in understanding the Jesus, not from a Christian or Pauline perspective, but from a Judaic perspective. So the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the Gnostic Gospels, says, do not what you yourself hate. Well, that's almost identical to what Philo says. And it's also identical to what Hillel says. What's hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, while the rest is the commentary thereof. Now go and study the Torah. Now that's from Tractate Shabbat, page 30a. And while this passage is very well known, we often forget the context in which the golden rule was originally set. You have these two Gentiles, and they happen to love practical jokes. They almost remind me of myself when I was a teenager. I used to call the Christian churches and speak to the ministers and badger them about what's going to happen to me if I don't believe in Jesus. So it was a great learning experience. And I could understand the practical jokers who were talking about playing a joke on the rabbis. And so one would go to the rabbis of the first century. Actually, they weren't really called rabbis back then. The term rabbi was starting to be used in the first century. It was really used after the destruction of the temple. And so they go before, or one of them goes before Shammai, who is an arch-conservative, and he says, will you teach me the Torah while I stand on one foot? And he did it with a straight face. But Shammai was not amused. So what do you think he did? He took a broom and started chasing the fellow out. And he says, next time you come and make fun of my religion, I'm going to hit you real hard with this broom. Well, imagine the laughs that he received when he told his friend what had happened. Boy, those Jews are very hot-headed. They need to take a class in anger management. And so what does the practical joker do next? He goes to Hillel. And what does Hillel tell him? He tells him, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. And this is the whole message of Torah. Now, let's compare this statement here to the remark that we find in the book of Matthew. Do to others whatever you would have them do to you. This is the law and the prophets. In the book of Luke 6:31, it says, do unto others as you would have others do upon you. Wait a minute. So is this the great statement of Judaism? And what's really the difference between Hillel and Jesus? Let me give you a good analogy. In fact, you could ask, why doesn't Hillel say, do unto others as you would have others do upon you, do for you? The answer is Hillel understands the individual who has appeared before him. He knows he's trying to get a laugh at Hillel's expense. But Hillel is a very patient teacher. And he's not going to give this huckster the amusement he's looking for. Instead, he's going to give him a very, very thought-provoking answer while he stands on one foot. And he says, be considerate unto others. That's the message of Torah. Now, how does that differ from what it says in Matthew or Luke? The difference is Jesus speaks of the golden rule, and Hillel is speaking of the silver rule. And there's an important distinction between the two. What is more valuable, gold or silver?
Gold.
Gold, of course. On the other hand, Hillel says, do no harm to your neighbor. The question we have to ask ourselves is, doing no harm to our neighbor, does that make an individual a good human being?
No.
Well, why? Why is that?
Because there's more to do in a positive way, positive things.
Okay, and you may recall that you've been in my classes in the past, but what you're saying is correct. All it means is that you're not a grubber young, as we say in Yiddish. You're not an uncouth slob. If you follow what Hillel says, you can be decent, but you're not going to be exceptional. And what Jesus says is do unto others in positive actions what you would want done unto yourself. Now, for a person who's making jokes about other people's religion, they're not ready to make that kind of step in their moral evolution. It's going to take them a little bit more time. The first thing they have to do is do no harm. A little bit like the Hippocratic Oath. When you see a doctor, what must a doctor do if nothing else?
Don't make it worse.
Don't make your patient's condition worse than it already is.
Right.
Now that doesn't make the doctor an exceptional doctor. And so we find in the Psalms a very interesting statement. It says, "Sor mira v'yaseh tov." You shall turn from evil and do good. Now, this is analogous to Hillel and Jesus's remark. You could say they're two sides of the same coin. And the question you can ask, of course, in this biblical passage in the Psalms is, why not just do good? Why must we turn away from evil? Well, so long as you're holding on to evil, your goodness is going to be questionable. Your motivation is going to be questionable. So if we look at this statement in terms of morality 101, what do we find? The first thing you got to do is stop acting like a jerk. You got to stop acting like a shlemiel, a shmagegi, or whatever term you want to use in Yiddish. Now, once you've mastered that skill, now you can focus on doing positive things on behalf of your neighbor. Now you can grow. And that's what Hillel says to him. This is the basic message of the Torah, but by no means is it the entire Torah. You now got to study the commentary and apply it. And this is a very, very valuable teaching. So, the question I'm now going to ask is this the only golden rule of Judaism? What do you think?
No.
Huh?
No, but I don't know.
Okay, well, you're going to have to explain yourself.
Right.
So, what is your motivation?
I just think that we have to be righteous and thoughtful and caring in what we do in a positive way. We have to be willing to take things on that will make the world better. You know, and it's not so important that anybody necessarily know it, but it's something that we do from our insides, from our hearts, and to make the world a better place. It can be something very small or something very grandiose. I mean, I just think that's all part of the golden rule, in my mind at least, of giving back to the earth, giving back to nature what we've taken, and to leave it in, as good a state as we found it or better.
Well, Rabbi Kiva gives another formulation of the golden rule. And he cites the biblical verse from Leviticus love your neighbor as yourself. This is the Klal Gadol, this is the great principle of the Torah. So, how do we understand the precept of love? Now, let me see if I can find it here in the Chumash. And I'll give you some examples of this. Okay, here, and if you go to chapter 19, verse 18, which is the statement of loving your neighbor as yourself, we find a illustration of this. For one thing, it says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. Now, I don't know about you, but I can honestly say there's some people that I've met that I do not particularly like. So how does the Torah legislate something as a feeling? Tell me how not to feel. Can anybody legislate emotions? Can a parent command that their children should love them?
No. It's got to come from within.
It has to come from the child. Hopefully we teach and model the best kind of behavior to our children. But what do you do if you meet somebody that you really don't particularly like? Well, take a look at the rest of Leviticus. It says, you shall rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. Now, what does that mean? We're building up to Leviticus 19:18, about the love of neighbor. Meaning that if you're really concerned about your neighbor, what should you do if you see something wrong?
Lovingly point them in the right direction.
Point them in the right direction. Now, if you take a look at the Mitzvah of Rebuke, you find something really interesting here. Most people, when they rebuke, do they do it sincerely or do they have an agenda?
They have an agenda.
Well, some people might not have an agenda. Some people might be genuinely concerned with your behavior, or you might be concerned with someone else's behavior. But there are many people who are incapable of giving moral criticism. Why is that? Because they get their jollies off of that.
Right, yep.
That's problematic.
Or it's easier to walk away from somebody and just not deal with it if there's nothing in return for you. And that's not what the issue should be.
All right, but that's an excellent point, Ray. It's a lot easier for us to just simply make believe the problem does not exist. But is making believe that the problem doesn't exist, does that solve the problem?
No.
What is your moral obligation towards your neighbor?
Well, it's not to pass the buck. It's to, as she said, to point the person in the right direction.
You have to do something, you have to try to rehabilitate the other person if you can.
Right.
And if you're sincere, your words are going to be effective.
Mm-hmm.
And then it said, do not bear sin because of it. Meaning that if somebody does something wrong, and we have the ability to correct that person, we don't, doesn't that make us morally accountable to some degree? So we have, now it says, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this illustrates how the Bible generally works. The Bible often gives us the general principles, and then it gives us a series of specifics. Now, in the case here of love, if we really want to understand what love is, then we can understand it to mean that we can't hate people in our heart. We have to be honest and forthright in criticizing them. We have to also learn to judge people with the benefit of the doubt. Another precept here: you should not act as a gossip monger among your people, and not standing not only by the blood of your neighbor, which is maybe very relevant to the news story that what we just mentioned. That we can't stand and just do nothing. We have responsibility to speak up and try to correct the problem as much as possible.
As Jews, what do you expect we should do when we come in contact with anti-Semites? Even important people are anti-Semites. They have power. And then, of course, there are neighbors and people just out there that are anti-Semites. What would you suggest that we do?
Love them.
What's that?
Love them. Teach them with an example. I have people that are a-holes to me, and the best way to slap them in the face is by showing them that whatever they think to you doesn't really offend you. On contrary, you're nice to them. And hopefully they'll be like, huh, I got no power over this guy. Otherwise, if they do something wrong to you and you react with violence, you're just a little puppet that gets manipulated by their words.
But don't you think there's probably something a little wrong with their thinking in the first place that they've erected? Maybe they just picked it up online or picked it up from somebody else, and they can be disabused of the notion why it's an irrational thought. But other people are a little more invested in it.
Well, I think going back to what we mentioned before, we should not make matters worse. And just because, there's a Jewish philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, and he was one of Europe's greatest philosophers of the 20th and early 21st century, Holocaust survivor from France. And one of the points that he mentions about morality, and you could say that this is his version of the golden rule, he said basically that don't think that that morality is symmetrical. If anything, morality is asymmetrical. Now, what he says is a little counterintuitive. What that means is that if somebody acts like a jerk towards you, that does not entitle you to reciprocate in kind. That what is that? The real test is we cannot lower ourselves and become the very people that we despise. Was it Nietzsche who said that some people will stare into the abyss, but we have to be careful that the abyss doesn't stare back at us. And this is one of the hardest things in the modern society, because how do we not become the very thing that we hate? And so this is why we have to act differently. It goes back to the concept of the golden rule, is that we have to find a positive way to get our message across. And there's no guarantee that the other person is going to be able to receive it. Now, let me go back over here to Rabbi Kiva's statement. Rabbi Kiva says, love your neighbor as yourself is the great principle of the Torah. What if I told you that there was a rabbi in the first century who differed with Akiva? Well, actually there was. His name is Ben Azai. And Ben Azai says, loving your neighbor as yourself is not necessarily the best principle in the Torah. And he gives a very interesting reason why. Let's say, for instance, you happen to be a masochist. Let's say you enjoy sleeping on a bed of nails. Let's assume you're a stingy person with yourself. Does that mean you can be stingy towards your neighbor? After all, you're not loving your neighbor any differently than you would love yourself. Anyone care to comment on that? What's wrong with this picture? So Ben Azai deduces a different biblical verse. He says his version of the golden rule is the passage in Genesis that says that God made every human being in the divine image. And if you abuse yourself, you're not respecting the divine image you're in, that God made you in the likeness of. And when he says something here is very psychologically compelling, is that love, to some extent, has to begin with yourself. If you can't love yourself in a positive way, I'm not talking about a narcissistic manner, I'm not talking about being selfish. If you cannot respect yourself, you're not going to be able to respect your neighbor. That's what Ben Azai is saying contra Rabbi Akiva. It's a novel.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes, what do you think of that interpretation?
No, I actually like that interpretation because I think some people, there's two things, like, okay, yes, two wrongs don't make a right, like, don't do something that you know is wrong, but also, like, loving people, but I lose track, but I like that, what this rabbi said, because, because people can't, take advantage and manipulate you, and you just, forgive them and love them and let them get away with it either. So, but my question was, you know how people say namaste, where it's where that means the light in me, sees the light in you? Is that referring, do you think they have an understanding of that divine spark from Hashem, the light in me sees the light in you, and our lights are happy? I don't know the whole phrase, but.
What do you want to say, Ray?
It makes sense. It's an Eastern way of saying that, I'm one with you on this, that I'm on the same wavelength as you, at least, in a general term, all right? And that's very important.
Same thing Kamala says, that we're all one and we're trying to put the pieces together, but we're all one. When we're one vessel, that's our goal as humanity, to become one again, as if when we were just one atom.
There's an interesting Hasidic story about a wealthy person who happened to be very stingy. And not only was he stingy with people who asked for donations, he was very stingy with himself. So what did the Hasidic rabbi tell this stingy person to do? He said, you should, instead of eating jelly sandwiches in the morning, have an omelet. Instead of just eating potatoes for dinner, why don't you have steak or a nice rotisserie chicken? Enjoy yourself, live life a bit. And so the students were a little surprised. Okay, the students were a little surprised. Why are you so concerned about this man's diet? So he says it's very simple. He's so stringent with himself, how can he not be stringent with everyone else he encounters? But if he could learn to be a little generous towards himself, maybe he'll give more of himself. He'll show generosity in helping his neighbor down the street. And so that's kind of the teaching of Ben Azai here. That do not say, since I've been humiliated, let my fellow man also be humiliated. Since I have been cursed, let my neighbor also be cursed. If you act this way, realize that you're doing something wrong because God made you in the divine image. And this, of course, is maybe one of the most important lessons that we can learn from Ben Azai's golden rule. So again, it almost sounds like pop culture to To some extent, you could say that if you can't love yourself, you're not going to be capable of loving another person. But if you think about it in terms of human relations, isn't that often the case? Why do people have such fragile relationships? Maybe Ben Adler is suggesting that people are broken, and broken people have a much harder time developing a healthy relationship with another person or with a healthy individual. And there's something to be said about that. Now, let's take a look at one of my favorite works. This is called the Letter of Aristeas. And this was written sometime in the about 2100 years or so ago in Alexandria. And it's a fictional story about how the Torah came to be written in Greek. And so it portrays the Jewish sages interacting with the Egyptian king at the time, Ptolemy presumably, and they're having an exchange of wisdom and philosophy. So what does he say here? What is the teaching of wisdom? And the Jewish sage replied, as you wish that no evil should befall you, but you would desire to be a partaker of all good things, you should act on the same principle towards your subjects and offenders. You should mildly admonish the noble and good, for God draws all people to himself through his compassion. So how is this a golden rule? It goes back to what Ben Sira said earlier. What is it that we really want from God? We can't expect anything from the divine that we're not willing to do ourselves. And the Kabbalists in particular have a very beautiful analogy of what this is compared to. In fact, they often speak of the high holiday services as a time of constructing a vessel. They call it a kli, for God's goodness. In other words, if we want whatever we want from God, we have to create the vessel for that thing that we want. So, for instance, let's say we want God to forgive us. So, what is the vessel that we must construct?
One that can receive forgiveness, and we can receive forgiveness by giving.
We have to extend forgiveness towards those people who have offended us. All right, let's say we want wealth. What's the vessel for receiving wealth? Tzedakah. Donating to the food kitchen. Helping out homeless people in a soup kitchen. Many things that we can do. What's another thing we want from God? Very high holidays.
Long life.
What?
Another year of life.
Another year of life. Well, if we want life, what is the vessel for receiving life?
Being grateful.
It's creating life. The God of life. The God who expects us to be advocates for those people whose lives are imperiled, endangered. You see, for instance, people starving after an earthquake, donating to a charitable organization that distributes food is a way of creating life. So whatever we want from God, we have to find a way to make that specific vessel. And this is what the Letter of Aristeas is teaching us. That if you want to be a partaker of all good things, especially since you're a king and you have the power to do so, then you got to act that way towards your subjects. You got to act that way towards the governed. You cannot look at your position as a privilege. In our last Shabbat, we were talking a little bit about Plato and democracy. Plato was not a great advocate of democracy. If Plato were alive today, what would he say about our government? What would he say about today's politicians?
That they're a bunch of schmucks.
They're corrupt.
He would say that they're corrupt. But who's responsible for their corruption?
We are.
We are.
Why?
Because we don't turn them out. We allow them to continue to be in office.
We enable them.
They do.
Because they have a golden tongue, because they appeal to our moral sensibilities. Plato says that the public often doesn't have the wisdom to discern the character of the people that's ruling over them, and so more often than not, they'll vote for an oligarch, for other wealthy people, or at worst they may even vote for a tyrant.
Yes.
Because a tyrant is skilled in, someone like Hitler was very, very skilled in public speaking. He knew how to appeal to their emotions.
Sure did.
Beth, I have a question.
Yes, what's your question?
Do you know which philosopher or whomever said this? Like, to whom much is given, much is required. So if you're given like a really powerful position, or you're given something, so you should be responsible. So to whom much is given, much is required. But if you don't hold up like the requirement part, like if you're blessed to have all these things and then you don't share or don't use it wisely.
Haven't we heard that in a movie? With great power comes
Spider-Man.
great responsibility.
With great power comes great responsibility.
And and George is our barber, and he says, with great looks also comes great responsibility.
That's what Spider-Man stole it from me.
But I've heard that for a long time, to whom much is given, much is required. It's like people don't.
Certainly, Rabbi Tarfon used to say that the work is not for you to complete.
Yep.
But you got to do your part.
Yep.
Now let's take a look at some other illustrations here of the golden rule. I have a few more. The letter of Aristeas explores this from a different perspective. What is the best path for a person to pursue in all his actions? So the sage replied, behave with integrity towards all and act justly on every occasion. Always be aware that every thought is known to God. If you make the reverence of God as your starting point, you will never, ever miss your goal.
Rabbi,
It's impossible to achieve, but it's something that we should always aspire to in our dealings every day with people.
I know who said too much, who is given, much is required.
Who?
It was Yeshua ben Yosef.
Okay,
Jesus.
Jesus said that. Well,
I
and here I thought Spider-Man was Jewish.
Luke 12:48.
Okay.
All right.
Interesting passage. Okay, but let's go back over here. What is the Hebrew word for integrity?
Integrity.
Tzedek,
Okay, and what do you call a person who does good things all the time?
Tzedekим.
Sadiq.
Sadiq,
How do we translate Sadiq?
a righteous person.
Righteous person.
All right, now let me ask you another question. How many people do you know who are righteous? Jack Lalwasser, do you know very many righteous people?
I do.
Okay. In our society, is righteousness the norm?
No.
Okay. So here's one of the problems with the term righteous.
I don't feel equipped to judge.
Well, we often think of righteous people as exceptional people. So like Martin Luther King,
Not true.
John F. Kennedy.
Not true.
But that's not what a tzaddik is.
No.
Yeah, no, they're not tzaddikim.
What about 11 publics? Were they each side?
Noah's called a tzaddik. Does that mean he prays all day? If you look there's a book called the Tanya, and it's the Bible of Chabad mysticism. And the author of the Tanya makes a very interesting argument. He says that a tzaddik is a person who never does anything bad, never says anything bad, never even thinks anything bad.
That person doesn't exist. Never has.
Very few people like that exist. And Carl Jung gives us the reason why. Because there's darkness inside every human being.
Yes.
And that aspect of darkness is what he calls the shadow. Who knows what lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. But the shadow is the part of our personality that we try to bury because we're embarrassed when it comes out from time to time. You know, when you're screaming at... Well, it could be the Yetzer Hara. It's like when you're driving down the road, somebody cuts you off, and you find yourself gesticulating like as if you were in a Catholic church, waving fingers and whatnot. You probably don't want your friends to see you in that unguarded moment. That's an example of the shadow. You see, in Judaism, there's no requirement that we have to govern our thoughts, words, and our actions, our speech, and our thoughts in that manner. Tzedek means something entirely different. Tzedek means integrity. Tzedek means doing the right thing, even when nobody's watching. Integrity means that you maintain honest weights in business. You don't cheat anyone, even though you can, even though no one's looking at you. A person of tzedek is committed to living a life of moral excellence. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have faults. It doesn't mean he doesn't sin. It doesn't mean that he doesn't do things that he's occasionally ashamed of, but he aspires to be something better than what he is.
So, in the book of Mishlei, when it says the righteous fall down 7 times and get up, is that word tzaddikim?
Well, a tzaddik will make mistakes. In fact, it also says in Ecclesiastes, "Ein tzaddik ba'aretz." There's no such thing as a perfectly righteous person in the world, someone who doesn't sin. Everyone makes mistakes. But the idea in Proverbs that you quoted just now is, can you pick yourself up? Can you dust yourself off from your mistakes? And if you keep repeating them, that's a problem, isn't it?
Yes.
You know what's so strange, if I can make an observation? This is just my case alone, maybe not other people. When it comes to dealing with people on the outside, in business or in others, people that I don't know, Jew as well as Gentile, I always try very hard to be as honest and forthright and on board as I possibly can. I would never think of knowingly cheating somebody. That's not to say that maybe I go as far as maybe I should in doing something, but I would never cheat somebody out of something. And yet it seems to me that in my dealing with family members sometimes, or people that are close to me, I'm not so honest. I mean, I don't know that that's intentional, maybe I don't know, it's a bad read, but that's just where I am.
Well, if you look at the concept of integrity and fairness, fairness implies that we don't have double standards. And that's a great problem in our contemporary society, because we tend to have different standards for other people as opposed to ourselves. I'll give you an example. When politicians tell everybody you have to wear a mask, and then they go around going to parties where no one wears a mask, that's not setting.
No.
That is not fair.
No.
And fairness requires that what you expect from others, you hold yourself to the same standard. You cannot hold yourself to a different standard.
Yeah.
And what makes Noah, now Noah often gets a lot of bad rap from when he's compared to Abraham, right? But I would make the case that Noah is greater than Abraham for many reasons. Did Abraham live in a real corrupt generation? Well, there were people. For the most part, he didn't.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, what about Noah? Did he live in a corrupt generation?
Yes, very much so.
Oh, and the world was so corrupt, what happened?
That created a flood.
Human corruption led to the flood. And so when you're surrounded by people who are trying to put you down,
Right.
and you're able to maintain your moral sense of integrity, and you live by principles of right and wrong, and it doesn't matter what everyone else says about you, you're committed to doing that, that puts you on a very, very different level.
Right.
Abraham did not have to worry about living in such a corrupt time.
Right. I think one of the most remarkable passages in Torah is when Abraham is dealing with God about what to do about Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, he's negotiating. He's pleading with them to leave these people alone, not to kill them. He knows they weren't good people, but nonetheless, he's well, what if somebody gets hurt who was good? I mean, he pleads all the way down the line for other people.
All right, let's examine that illustration, because it's a good point you make. What does Abraham tell God?
That there's even one person.
It is obscene that the judge of the world should not, that the judge of the world should just destroy so willy-nilly without taking into consideration that there might be innocent people. You know what that is? That's called chutzpah.
Yes.
But I thought that was one of the reasons why certain rabbis esteem Abraham higher than Noah, because Abraham pleaded for the innocent people, where Noah's like, okay, God, we'll just pack up ship and to hell with everybody else.
Well, that's the interpretation that Talmud often says about Noah, but it's not really correct. What do you think Noah was doing it took him at least a couple hundred years to build the ark. So what was he doing in the meantime?
Trying to convince them?
He was trying to convince his generation that they should change their evil ways. Well, that sounds like someone who's concerned about humanity. Noah is a problematic figure. Where's that coming from?
I don't know.
All right, let's take a look at a couple more golden rules, and then we'll adjourn for tonight. Judah Hanasi says, what is the right way which a person should choose for himself? Act honorably is the best way to win respect in the eyes of God and human beings alike. Honor. What is honor? How do we define it?
Honors respect.
Any other thoughts?
Well, I think it depends who you ask, because like I think people in Eastern cultures, like the Japanese or Chinese or like more Eastern cultures, I think they have much more like heaviness to their word honor versus how we use it in America. Like it's like different. It shouldn't be different, but like I just feel like certain cultures have more emphasis on the word honor than.
I hold somebody's interest as important as my own interest, as long as I don't see something that's negative to what they're doing in their interests. I care about what they think, and I think that's ultimate honor. I mean,
Well, the Hebrew word kaved is as in kaved et avicha v'et imecha. You shall honor your mother and father. The word kaved means to treat with weightiness.
Yes.
In other words, you gotta take that person's situation into consideration, and do the right thing, even though, as Lavina says, it's not always reciprocated. That's someone who's a mensch. All right, let's see what else. Okay, any other questions that people have? Remember, the only bad question is the one that's never asked. All right, so let's summarize a little bit some of the things that we mentioned here. We spoke about the golden rule, and there are different traditions, and Rabbi Akiva says, love your neighbor as yourself. That is the number one principle of Torah, the great principle. Ben Azai disagrees, and he says the fact that God made us in the divine image, that is the most important principle of Torah. And then we have the Hillel and Jesus, and both these scholars are saying different things. They're not. One is not arguing with the other. They're speaking about different contextual situation. For people who are not especially moral, for people who struggle acting like refined human beings, the first lesson for them, according to Hillel, is to not hurt their neighbor. And that's no small undertaking. And like it says in the Psalms, turn from evil, and then you can do good. And what Jesus is speaking about is that it's not enough to just simply not be a bad person. You can be a decent person, but you can become a better person by doing good for your neighbor. And we mentioned the story of, the example from Ben Sira, the Jewish philosopher that lived 2,200 years ago, that we cannot ever expect anything from God that we're not willing to put out for ourselves. And this is also the statement that we find in the book of Aristeas. It says that we have to behave with integrity towards all, and beware that everything we do is observed by God. Interesting statement. I would just add that the real atheist, according to the rabbis, is not the person who says there is no such thing as God. You know what the word atheist means? It comes from the Greek word atheos. The alpha is oppositional. Theos means God. The alpha means against God. It could also mean without God. So the real atheist is not necessarily a person who denies God's existence, but is acting in cross purposes to God. So you could be conceivably a religious person, observant of the Shabbat, observant of many other mitzvot. You could be davening 3 times a day, wearing tefillin from sunrise to sunset practically. That doesn't make you an exceptional person. If you're dishonest in how you deal with other people, if you're harsh when you should be kind, that's acting in cross purposes to God. And sometimes the most, Dante says the lowest level of hell, there's 7 levels of hell according to Dante in his poem, the Inferno. Who do you think occupies the lowest level of hell?
Apathetic people.
Religious hypocrites. People who don't walk their talk. People who live by double standards. People who put on a facade of morality, but in reality, but their own personal lives are anything but moral.
Many of them are the most religious of all people. Think they are. Think they're the most religious of all people.
Well, but ask yourself another question. Is it easier to be a religious person or is it harder to be a moral person? What do you think?
More harder to be a moral person.
Why?
Because it gets to the essence of who you are. The real, to be moral, it's got to be real. It's got to come from within you. It has to generate something within you. It's a way of life. Religious, anybody can say they're religious. Anybody can take a course. I know people who wanted to be converted to Judaism for no good reason. They spent 2 years with a rabbi. Finally, he converts them, and they never show up anymore. It's just something they wanted to wear on their shoulder as an achievement. And of course, go ahead.
I think the reason it's harder to be a moral person versus a quote unquote religious person is because religion in itself, like I guess the way we tend to understand it as a Western culture, is like it's a lot of external things. So you can like wear the tefillin, you can wear the tzitzit, you can pray 3 times a day, like you can do all this stuff that's part of a religion, but if it's not part of your spirituality, not part of your inner moral being, that doesn't amount to anything.
Right. Better you're an atheist or an agnostic, but you have high morals and live up to them. Much better.
So in a way, you could say that there's an interesting Hasidic story. Someone asked the Rebbe, if you say we can learn something holy from everyone, what can you learn from an atheist? So the rabbi stroked his beard and he said, that's a very interesting question. When you see a person on the street corner who's poor, you should say to yourself, no one in this world is going to help this person, not even God, unless I help this person first. And so that was his approach to atheism, that you could be a moral atheist. If you read the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, even though he claims to be an atheist, in many ways, his principles of morality are much more compatible with traditional faith.
Bertrand Russell, too.
Yeah, and Bertrand Russell wrote a very interesting book. You remember what it is?
Yeah, why not a Christian? Love it.
Why I Am Not a Christian. And what was his major beef with the Christian faith?
Because there's no love like Christian hate. I don't know, I never read the book.
Well, what does Christianity say about forgiveness? You shall forgive 7 times 70, right?
Yeah.
You would think that Christians are the most forgiving people in the world.
Say Hail Marys.
All right.
You're absolved.
Okay. Who are Christians generally not forgiving towards?
Jews.
Why?
Because
People that are not like this.
So that's problematic, isn't that? Forgiveness, is not.
What was your point? What was the question you asked, Rabbi?
About forgiveness?
No. What was it about Christians? I just missed
No,
that.
the Christians hate us because supposedly we
we are the reason why their Savior was crucified.
Yes, so you see, religious people don't always walk their talk. And that is a kind of hypocrisy. And so I'd rather be with an atheist who has moral principles than religious people who don't take their own religion very seriously. And that, by the way, applies to any denomination, not just Christianity. You could be a superficial Orthodox Jew. You could be a superficial conservative Jew. You could be a superficial Reformed Jew. If you take your Judaism serious, you are a person of faith. Maybe that's the lesson we can walk away with. All right, everyone. I want to thank you very much for coming tonight. And if you want to make a donation, by all means, anything you donate is always appreciated. And next week's class, we're going to focus on converting to Judaism. And that's going to be a very interesting program, because we're going to learn a little bit about Judaism would have been a world religion the size of Christianity and Islam had it not been for the Christianization of Rome. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And good to see you all. And Liliana, good to see you. And Ani, good to have you as well. I want to welcome a few of our new people here. Make sure I got their names correct. Jack Lauwasser and Gary Glasser. I hope you got something out of tonight. And Leslie, remember, the only bad question is the only question that's never asked. So Judaism, this is very important for us to remember, that Judaism is a religion that loves questioning. And we question God, we question each other, and questions are more important than answers. You know why? Because questions force us to look deeper into a situation and examine the problem. And it's the fun of discovering that makes the asking questions so valuable. All right, everyone.